Croeso to Wrexham News. I'm Councillor Carrie Harper.
I'm Councillor Marc Jones.
And today we're talking to Cllr Sam Swash from Flintshire. Your ward is Mancott and Harden?
Harden and Mancott.
Harden, yeah. Nearly.
Yeah,
nearly
well, Harden
right.
dot Mancott, but everyone just calls it Harden and Mancott.
Yeah, okay. And we're going to be talking, drum roll, about the local development plan in Flintshire and comparing the experience that we've had, because to a certain extent we've gone through the same experience and then obviously after a certain point we had a very different outcome here than what you've had in Flintshire. So I suppose that's the best place to start the conversation is, can you tell us a little bit about Flintshire's LDP and your experience as a councillor in terms of dealing with it and the objections to it and all the rest of it?
Yeah, so Flintshire's local development plan covers the period 2015 to 2030. And before I was elected, there wasn't really any opposition to it. It was going through almost unanimously in the council chamber. There was one councillor, I think, who would regularly vote against it. But I was elected on almost a single issue campaign opposing a particular development, large development in my ward. And then I spent the next year and a half sort of organising opposition to the LDP more broadly, not only because of the issues in my ward, but because of issues relating to lack of affordable housing, the same sort of thing that we've been fighting in Wrexham. And we did manage to get some opposition to the LDP itself. I think on the vote in the end, about 14 councillors opposed it, which was obviously a big difference from nobody, but still it passed really quite easily. 8 years late, obviously it passed in 2023. And that replaced the unitary development plan, which itself was 11 years late. So Flintshire has a bit of a habit of adopting these plans really late, and obviously you then have wards in in that period where it's not adopted that get rinsed with speculative development, which was a couple of places like Penforth and Kinnerton. So since the local development plan has been adopted, the fire's really become against that particular development, which is for 300 houses in Harden and Mancott. The land was owned by Charles Gladstone, who is the descendant of Sir William Gladstone, and he owns a lot of the land and buildings in Harden and Mancott, and he put the land forward as part of as a site for the local development plan. But the community had opposed that site. It had been allocated in the UDP as well, the Unitary Development Plan, sort of 15 years before. The community had opposed it then, and it got taken out at the last minute by the leader of the council at the time, who I think recognised that he could get the UDP through quite easily, except for that site. So he made a political decision to remove that site, which I think could have been a way forward on the LDP. It wouldn't have dealt with the issues with affordable housing, but it probably would have meant they would have had a lot less hassle than they did. But they refused to take that course of action on this one. So the planning application for the site itself was approved about a month ago now in a farcical planning meeting, which started with the councillor on the live. It wasn't on the live stream because the recording hadn't started, but so the room itself was full of residents who turned up to watch the meeting, and the first thing that happened was one councillor said, "Can somebody send me the agenda? I can't find it because of all the crap I've had from residents of Mancott."
Oh, really?
Yeah. And then we had another councillor admit that he hadn't read any of the 200 or so emails he'd had in advance of the meeting and was just going to vote on the application anyway. Said he'd been instructed not to read them by officers, which is obviously deeply concerning.
Wow.
Yeah.
And there's also a case which I can't go into too much detail about, predetermination. So the meeting was just a farce, to be honest. And we sent an open letter which was signed by 13 councillors asking for a formal investigation into it, asking for the decision to be revoked because of the process, the lack of process at planning committee, the things that planning committee members said, and we've not even had an acknowledgement of that letter, let alone a response. So,
and it was a contentious issue. Why was this particular one so contentious?
Because some of the issues are unique to Harden and Mancott, but a lot of them also, you can be replicated everywhere. Lack of access to dentists. Impossible to get a dentist basically now. Doctor's surgery, our local doctor's surgery in Harden, is already at twice the capacity for the GP. So I think the best practice is one GP per 2,500 patients. It's currently double that, and that's before this development. People are really struggling to get their kids into local schools. And the site is also towards the top of the hill, and towards the bottom of my ward, Lower Mancott and then Sandycroft ward, for years has been really struggling with devastating flooding. Every time there's a heavy bit of rainfall, houses flood, gardens flood. Some people have had to move out, can't get home insurance anymore. I think there's one family who've lived in hotels for long periods because their house has just been ruined. And this development is going to feed directly into the existing water and sewage infrastructure. So obviously there's huge concerns about exacerbating the problem with flooding that already exists. And also people in Harden and Mancott, from my experience, they don't want a massive estate of, executive homes. They recognise that the housing we need is, affordable homes, smaller houses, bungalows as well, and this development provides basically none of that. It'll be 35% affordable housing, allegedly, but obviously as we
come back and
Section 106, it'll all get whacked down. It'll be...
And we know they're affordable isn't necessarily what locals would deem affordable.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way that somebody, a young person who maybe just out of university is going to be able to afford one of the affordable homes on that development. No. It's just not going to happen.
I saw something similar in Wrexham over the weekend. There's a new development. They're advertising starting prices at 290,000. So you're affordable. If you have your 30% off market value, is still not affordable really anyway. But they won't even. I'd be very surprised if that 35% materialises.
Yeah, I just can't see it. I mean, there's loads of examples in Flintshire where the developers have found issues on the site and then they've used that to lower either Section 1, the money that goes to affordable housing or to local schools, because I think there's about £900,000 allocated for local schools. But again, whether that actually materialises in full.
Question on health, just to hone in on that for a minute, because one thing that we've been really frustrated about is, I think the LDP generally and individual housing applications. Obviously, Betsy Cadwallader Health Board is a statutory consultee, and they've already acknowledged the developments that were proposed in Wrexham would require additional GPs, but they never object.
Yeah.
They never make any comments, even though we all know there's a massive implication for health. Have you found the same thing in Flintshire?
Yeah, we had exactly the same. So Betsy Cadwallader had put in some of the documentation as part of the application. They'd basically said about the medical practice in Harden that they were concerned that it was already struggling to cope, and that the additional number of people as a result of this development would potentially push them past breaking point. They'd said that as part of the thing. We obviously used that in the planning committee to say it's obvious that our local health facilities can't cope, and you just get the same response. They haven't actually formally objected in any way, so they're just...
It's a real problem, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it points to systemic issues that I think it's been made almost impossible to have these statutory consultees actually object in any meaningful way, because if they're saying basically this doctor's surgery already can't cope, and we certainly don't think it can cope with the additional strain on it, then why aren't they objecting? It doesn't make any sense, does it?
No, I'm really curious about this because it would be an opportunity for the health board to get additional funding off the developers if that's the way they're thinking, or to prevent those additional overbearing pressures coming on. So I'd be fascinated to know what their thinking is. Is it just lack of capacity, in the planning field?
I mean, and I don't know if it's. I mean, I've been told as well that there's this perception that the health board basically has to provide for however many people there are in a given area. So it doesn't matter. If there's 1,000, 2,000, 3, whatever the number is, they have to provide for them. So that that facility in Harden is just going to have to deal with it. And I think therefore, you get this position perhaps where they don't object because they're essentially told, well, you're just going to have to deal with whatever the influx is, because that's your job is to deal with it. That's not
sustainable, is it? It just can't go on.
No, I mean it's a joke, and I mean there's. Health is one example. I mean, we spoke about dentists as well, but it's the same with schools. Yeah. Local people are being forced to take their kids, further out because they're being pushed out of the catchment zone.
Yeah.
There's just I think it's a systemic problem, and local development plans I think have been designed in a way to basically lead to bad developments.
Do you know what you might find interesting? I don't know if you're aware of maybe some of the plans or strategic plans that were around before the LDP. There was something called the West Cheshire North East Wales Sub-Regional Strategy. It's a bit of a mouthful. We sort of dubbed it the West Cheshire Plan. And you're going back to sort of 2004, but it was supposed to span between 2004 and 2021, and it was all about housing development, basically. and it was driven by, it was the Mersey Alliance, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So it was rubber stamped by Welsh Assembly, as it was called at the time, and Flintshire and Wrecsam councils. Was Denbighshire Council on there as well? I think it was, wasn't it?
They pulled out of the Mersey Alliance, didn't they?
They pulled out, yeah. And it was all about basically having North East Wales as overspill because of a lot of the tight planning restrictions around Cheshire, basically. And Flintshire was becoming saturated, so Wrexham came into the picture, and Denbighshire and Conwy to a certain extent. Now, that plan got scrapped in name because it was so controversial, but what it said was the housing numbers will come through the LDP process, which is what both of our counties have seen since. So even though they said, oh, people don't like the sound of this, we're going to back off the actual strategy, they fed the housing numbers through anyway. And I think that's really important, because it's concerning how little input local residents or even most local councils actually get in terms of strategic planning, because a lot of that was pushed by vested interests, housing developers. That's what they wanted. So by the time it gets to us in a planning policy or a planning committee, a lot of it is signed, sealed and delivered. And I think that's so worrying, because we're seeing the impact of that now, because the sustainability doesn't come in, genuine housing needs like affordability doesn't come in. And I'm really worried about where we go next as well, because we're looking at these corporate joint committees taking a more strategic approach to housing. Well, if you've seen what that strategic approach has looked like, I think that's a real worry.
Because obviously the LDP, they wanted community engagement. They got that community engagement locally. But that said, we don't want to build outside settlements. We want more affordable housing, build on brownfield sites. And that was just totally ignored.
Because strategy had already been set elsewhere by an unelected body, basically.
And obviously, who's driving that ultimately are developers. Developers want to build on greenfield sites.
It's cheaper.
It's cheaper. You can get a bigger premium. And you just wonder, at what stage do you put up with that? And I think that's the message I think that comes from all this, is you can keep on putting up with it, and you'll get communities being shafted, merging in some terrible urban sprawl, and in somewhere like Deeside, where land is already at a premium, having some green space around your community is really important, I think, isn't it? And I think that's the feeling here as well, that you lose that green field. You're losing more than just somewhere to take the dog for a walk. It's a really precious sort of thing, and it defines a community as well. I think as well there's huge pressure for genuinely affordable housing, whether it's social housing council or housing association, or genuinely affordable for first time buyers. Where is that housing going to go when every available bit of land has been taken up by these executive houses that we saw with the figures for Wrexham? They got their population projections wrong. It was way off. What did they say first of all? Was it 20% increase in population? Now it's going to decline by 1.5. And they based all of this on wrong presumptions in terms of housing as well. So it's just completely unsustainable, isn't it?
And I think that filters down, because we spent a good part of 8 years opposing that particular development, and contribute to every consultation, and it was just obvious from the beginning pretty much that it was all just window dressing. We had the biggest petition in Flintshire's history, the most objections in recent history to any planning application. None of it mattered in the end, because it was a site allocated in the local development plan. And that was also an issue that we had, is at the LDP phase, before the LDP was adopted, I was getting quite a lot of support from people saying, you're doing the right thing to oppose this. And then those people were being told, well, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Don't vote against the LDP because of one site. The time to deal with issues with one site is at planning committee.
We've heard
Fast
all of
forward
this.
to planning committee, and then they say, well, actually, it's in the LDP, so there's nothing you can do about it. And we saw that no matter what issue we brought up, whether it was the really clear evidence on health, the response you got from the officers and the developer was just, well, it's allocated in the local development plan. So none of that mattered, really. None of the objections mattered.
The green light, once it's in that local development plan, it's got a green light, basically, isn't it?
And I think it encourages, in my experiences, and I think it's even worse in Wrexham given the size of the developments that were put forward, is if you're the person in charge of the local development plan in a particular council, the way to get it through, and this is what happened in Flintshire, I think what happened in Wrexham, is to have a smallish number of large sites, because then you can rely on the majority of councillors whose wards are unaffected to vote them through.
If you were cynical, you might look at it like that, mightn't you, Sam?
Yeah. I mean, because I think in Flintshire's own documentation, it does say that there's a preference for smaller sites. They don't want big sites, and yet pretty much every site in the LDP is a big site, because I think they knew, okay, we'll have 11 big sites. They might affect 11 wards, but we can rely on the other 40 or so to vote it through, because their wards will be protected.
What was the largest, or generally the size of sites you had in yours? Because like you say, we had huge sites. We had one 1680 houses and the other one 1500. They just piled all the housing that they wanted into those 2 sites. But you're saying you had sort of 11 then?
Yeah, 11, and I think most of them are around, so the one in my ward is 300, there's another one in Ewloe which is 300 houses, so our total housing number is 7,000. There's a big site in Garden City, so yeah, I mean I thought ours were big sites, and then I heard what the site sizes were in Wrexham,
but anything you can do
but in both cases, I think it shows how you can have this incentive for the council to just shaft a few communities with big developments, because they know it would take a lot of work, wouldn't it, to do anything else to get small sites pepped up, which is the way it's supposed to be, but in reality,
I think that's the critical thing, because we'd had our first LDP refused. There was pressure then on officers to deliver, these extra houses based on these flawed population projections. So the easy thing was, stick one that side of town, stick one that side of town, and then another 500 this side of town. Wrexham was, absolutely surrounded, and one of those got through as well, in that little window. So, it's more than 3,000 houses, potentially, we're going to add. Very few of them, nothing like 35% affordable.
Yeah.
I think 15 and 20%, and of, this affordable business. And I think this is something that still rankles with me, is that when we sent it out to the inspectors, we had, it was about 1,000, just over 1,000 of those 7,700 houses were affordable. When it came back, they'd halved that, and yet we weren't allowed to object because it was deemed sound, and they said, well, you sent it out to the inspectors. It was a fundamentally different plan that came back, and we should have had the right anyway. Well, we found out that we did have the right not to adopt it, but this sort of, hang on, you can move the goalposts on one thing, and we're not allowed to have a say. And the whole thing has been a massive eye opener, as I'm sure it is for you in terms of going through that process. But it also means that people get very cynical about, we've got no control, and they'll blame the council or they'll blame whoever, but they don't really blame the vested interests sufficiently, in my mind. And the vested interests are those people who are making millions out of these developments. One development we reckon will bring £75 million in profits. Even at the kind of lower end of the scale.
Yeah. And I think there is this huge democratic deficit, isn't there, where you've got, just people that don't feel like they've got any real say in influencing the process whatsoever. I mean, that's certainly the case in Flintshire. People just feel, and it feeds this discontent with politics more generally. People look at the council, they look at Welsh Government, and they just think, well, they're in the pockets of developers, because it seems to be completely developer-led.
Yeah, exactly. And when you do stand up against it, I think this is interesting, because this is where sort of Flintshire and Wrexham diverge. Is that we refuse to adopt our local plan, or the majority of councillors did. And the response to individual councillors, because we did that, was horrific. I don't think we'll ever see anything like this again in terms of what happened in Wrexham. And you were at the centre of that, really, in terms of...
Well, it's just interesting, isn't it, how things can be piled on you in terms of, obviously we had the law, we had the court action by the developers. that was heavy enough. But also on a personal level, you've got a police investigation.
6 months. No, just go back a second. Right?
Sorry, I'm glossing over a police investigation,
I mean,
like it happens all the
to
time.
have 3 senior councillors just for opposing this plan, basically, be under investigation by North Wales Police for 6 months. Not really being updated, it's got to be said, in terms of what on earth was going on either. I mean, that's unheard of, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, there was that, and luckily they decided there was no action to be taken. But then at the same time, we were subject to ombudsman complaints, which is serious, because they can disqualify you, they can suspend you. You know, it has implications. And as other people will know, if you've been through the process, it's not pleasant. Being presented with a bundle, in my case, it was almost 400 pages of evidence against you, including some senior officers who decided they were going to try and take you down. And so 20 months later, you find out, oh, actually, they're not going to take any action either.
20 months
Yeah.
after.
Yeah. I think you're more annoyed than I am.
I am really annoyed. I mean, I've had ombudsman complaints, you know.
Yeah.
It's sort of part and parcel of the job, but I mean, that it goes on for so long is just not acceptable, because the individual stress. Nobody signed up to be a councillor to be told, basically, you can go to jail for voting. We had that.
Yeah.
That you're going to be investigated by the police because you're trying to represent people's views in the council, or that you're going to have to go to the Court of Appeal and ultimately the Supreme Court just to have the right to exercise your democratic right to vote. It's just astonishing, really, isn't it? And so I can understand, in terms of Flintshire to an extent, that people probably felt pretty hemmed in when it came to accepting the LDP, because everything's against you. Absolutely everything is against you, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that was my perception, that most councillors just, you know, it was almost like there was no option to reject an LDP, you know, and the sort of pressure that you've come under, I mean, I've come under a fraction of that in Flintshire. I mean, because in Flintshire it was sort of, you know, I was leading that on my own. I didn't have, you know, other groups and other councillors weren't necessarily supporting. We did get, as I say, 14 or so to vote against in the end. But yeah, I think the fight that you had in Wrecsam has kind of let the genie out of the bottle on LDPs for the Welsh Government, because, you know, moving forward now, hopefully the message is clear to councillors across Wales that actually you can stand up for your communities, you can vote against these things, you can reject an LDP if it's not fit for purpose. And obviously you've probably paid a pretty high price for that because of the, you know, police investigation, ombudsman complaints, you know, but you did win in the end, and I think that is a victory not just for Wrexham but for the whole of Wales.
I think what's really important about it is when we first challenged the Welsh Government and developers, Welsh Government laid in very, very hard. It was, I think it was more not about the individual plan, not about the individual developments. It was more about, we're in charge, you do not challenge us. You know, we're going to set an example for every council, and that's why they fought this tooth and nail, to the extent that they were the only ones who took it to the Supreme Court. Now, what does that tell you about Welsh Government's priorities? They're more interested, for me anyway, the perception for me was they're more interested in defending the developer's right to develop wherever they want than listening to the local democratic elected councillors. And that's been a hell of a learning curve, I think. You know, I think we all suspected it, that we all kind of had this perception that they wanted, you know, total control. And I think that's the importance. I agree with you. I think it is a bit of a test case, and hopefully now we're in a situation where we will be calling for Welsh Government to withdraw the LDP, accept that it's dead, and move on. You know, and that's, everybody wants to move on now. You know, but moving on our terms, moving on in Wrexham's terms, making sure that a local plan, a local housing plan, works for the interests of Wrexham communities. It's not asking a lot.
No.
And I think the other lesson as well in terms of Welsh Government is throughout the whole process there was never any accountability, even though we kept saying, but your housing numbers are wrong. Yeah, but if you want the plan, why don't you enforce it? You know, and the truth is, it didn't want the political accountability. Labour didn't want the accountability of being seen to enforce this because they knew how unpopular it was. So they did everything behind closed doors in terms of court processes and all the rest of it. Whereas democratically, people should have a right to know who is driving this stuff. You know, it's all come out in this process in the end, isn't it? But there's so many lessons from this in terms of how not to do things going forward, hopefully, that have been learned. We'll see, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, and just the fact that, local councillors were taken to court by the Welsh Government, developers. I mean, it's just, I think for people...
Our own council.
Yeah, your own council. I think from the outside looking in, for residents, that just won't make any sense at all. It is crazy to think that they would go to those lengths to try and stop you essentially representing your residents. And it can be really, obviously it's frustrating, but it can also be really demoralising as a councillor to have to go through that, to have to fight on that level. And I say that as someone who's just fought on one side. I've not been taken to court yet, touch wood. When you sign up to be a councillor, you obviously sign up to fight for your residents, but you don't necessarily expect to have to go to those lengths to stand up for them.
No, it wasn't on my bucket list, I'll be honest with you. Ended up in the Supreme Court. Yeah.
But it was worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, your political journey as well, that's evolved since you got elected, and we've been talking about Labour, Welsh Government, where are you now in terms of that? And
in terms of where I am politically, so I, myself and a group of 4 others left the Labour Party in Flintshire about just over a year ago now. And we formed Flintshire People's Voice, so it's a political party that stands for, basically standing up for the people of Flintshire, closing the name really, Flintshire People's Voice. But it's about standards. We found that as backbench councillors we were being dismissed, ignored, treated like crap.
Even within your own group?
Within the Labour group, any idea that came from a backbencher was dismissed, and often not in a particular nice way either. It didn't make you, and I think, the message I think that was being sent was, backbenchers, it's not your place to bring up policy ideas and things like that, so get back in your box. And then we had an issue where a cabinet member misled a committee, and we were being expected to vote for him to go back into cabinet at the AGM, and we said we're not willing to do that. It's about standards, and having standards, we cannot have somebody in position who does that. There was, they refused. They then put that person into cabinet, and we couldn't then remain in the group, so we crossed the floor, then formed Flintshire People's Voice, and we had a lot of success in the first year. We've been quite surprised by how our message has got across so well. We've been recruiting members quite well, and things are going really. We've got a full manifesto which we've got printed and published, so we're the only party in Flintshire that's got an up-to-date manifesto, because nobody else, none of the other parties seem to bother having ideas. So it's definitely been a journey, but when I got elected. I mean, I got elected in spite of being Labour, I think. I was opposing their local development plan. Then my experience within that group for the year or so I was in there was pretty unpleasant. And then you combine that with this sort of lack of standards, but also just incompetence. The leadership has sort of flung from one crisis to another in Flintshire, and there's a real void of leadership, and we just weren't willing to put up with that anymore. So we're trying to put forward a case for a return, not just to competence, but a little bit of ambition for the people of Flintshire to say, actually, we don't just want to have managed decline. We want to actually make things better, make people's lives better.
It's not much to ask, is it?
No, I mean, we should all be elected to do that, really, but it just seems so many, from my experience, just want to manage the status quo at best. And that's just not good enough.
It needs shaking up, and I think housing development and local development plans and all that is the perfect example of why, because things have just been done in a certain way for too long, but the impact on communities is huge, and it needed calling out. Hopefully we've started the process of that in Wrexham. Hopefully we can continue that process in Welsh Government as well, in terms of overhauling the planning process, so we get development based on local need. Shock horror. What an awful thing to do. That we provide affordable housing, that we have the right housing, the right type, in the right place for people. It's not rocket science, is it? It just takes people with the will to actually get it done, and obviously, Sam, I can see you're one of those people, so best of luck for the future, and diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you very much. Thank you.